Welcome, everyone. I'm Barbara Adachi, and I'm really excited to see so many of you out here joining us today. We have a great session planned for this morning, and we're really hoping to make it very interactive and conversational. So you'll see me kind of having a bit of a conversation with Tina on a couple of different topics within her presentation. I wanted to just really acknowledge NACD, Northern California, and also San Pinnacle for making this program happen today. We're really excited to partner together on this topic. A little bit of background on kind of how this topic came about, and I'll be introducing Tina just in a moment. Um, Tina I've been working together for a period of time. I've known her from various venues. She's a frequent speaker at different events, including for Ascend recently at our Aspiring Directors Academy. And at that presentation, she mentioned that for board directors like ourselves, that we should actually be refreshing our board bios and value propositions every 6 months, if not more often. And that's not something I personally do very much. So I was really struck by that. And I thought, with all of the changes that are going on externally that are surrounding us today, it's probably a good time for us to kind of relook at what we have out there in terms of not only our value proposition, but also our thought leadership. So this program today is really learning how to power that thought leadership component of your value proposition as a board director, and to either for your current boards and also, as you aspire to join other boards. So I'm really excited now to introduce Tina Chang. Tina is the founder of Pioneering Collective. I'm going to let her talk a little bit about herself and her organization, but she really works with executives and board directors, like many of us on the call today, to really help us kind of think about strategically what we want to do with our careers and our post-career efforts, endeavors around getting on boards, and really how to kind of refine our own value proposition and how we present ourselves to the broader community. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tina. And then, like I said, we're going to try to keep this very conversational today. So I encourage you, if you have questions, to put them in the chat. I will monitor those and bring them up, especially if there's a slide or two that resonates with you. Make sure that you take that opportunity. We'll also have time later to open it up more broadly and have everybody out there on the screen. But really excited. So Tina, with that, I'll turn it over to you and have you say words
Barbara,
about yourself and your
thank you so
organization.
much. Thank you for inviting me here. Thank you to NACD. And I'm so glad to be speaking with everyone. Barbara, to your point about board members we work with, we do encourage slight updates to your value prop or your board documents. Mainly because the market changes so quickly nowadays. In 6 months, a lot has changed. Or your goals for your next board might be very different, right? So that's one of the reasons, and I'll touch on that a lot more. A little bit about me. I am the founder of Pioneering Collective. We're a thought leadership accelerator. We're one of the only ones out there. We're so passionate about the thought leader, the human, who are creating impact in this world. We're not about a company visibility or product visibility. We're really about oftentimes they go to companies and say, well, we're about the humans in your company. And of course, it's not, we're very focused on business experts, business leaders. So mainly if they're within companies, they're CEO and C-suite. The other half of our community are actually, I say nobody retires, everyone rewires to different things. They're board members, really well-known business authors, top speakers. We support to continue to build their platform and compound their platform. So that's a little bit about me. I've led, my background is I've led speakers bureaus, I've led thought leadership marketing at large healthcare firms also. So that's a little background. Let me share a few slides as context. And as Barbara shared, we'll keep it conversational. Barbara, feel free to chime in at different points. I know you will. Maybe, to help clarify some things or point out some important things for the audience also. So let me pull up the slides and we'll get started here. And I'm going to start out with a question for the group. Feel free to put it in the chat in terms of, how would you just describe or define thought leadership? Or, is it important for you? Is this important in today's environment? And we're really thinking through thought leadership from a human thought leadership perspective, not a company's insights or data or information. So I'd love to see, your thoughts on this topic. And as board members, how do you think about your thought leadership? So I'm seeing that people think that it's important because it's how you share your point of view. And that unique point of view is really critical, so others recognize you for that voice. Providing key insights. Really, a lot of leaders in their third chapter oftentimes tell us, this is my life's work. If I could help others understand it better, that's incredible. And there's nothing more than that where they like to spend their time than helping others and educating others.
I think
Yeah,
you know,
some
this
people.
one, yeah, I love this one about kind of being how to think about a set of problems in a situation. So you kind of differentiate yourself. I think Teresa said kind of a unique perspective. So those are some really great definitions out there.
Yeah, and I love this element about being purposeful and intentional. And we'll talk about that in a bit. It's not a one and done when it comes to thought leadership. So feel free to continue to share a few thoughts. I think everyone can benefit from each other's wisdom on this topic. But let me go through how we tend to define thought leadership at Pioneering, and as we work with several hundred leaders in our community. We often say thought leadership is not about being known. It's not only about being known. It's actually about being known for making a difference, making an impact. So there is an element of you have to raise your visibility, your unique voice, but also what's the purpose of that? The purpose is so that you could create a difference for your industry or share unique insight or help educate others to create that impact. Or if you're looking at yourself as a board leader, how you build your reputation in a particular space. Companies will recognize that. They'll pull you in on their board to really create value, and that you're serving, the company and creating value based on the space that you know about, right? So we tend to say thought leaders usually have a unique voice, that point of view that somebody had talked about, a unique voice on a topic they believe in. And others have to be aware that this person is known for that unique voice, so that they're known for that. It's really important that that voice has value. You're adding value to your ecosystem, whether it's a board ecosystem or however way you define it. We have a member who says, I really just want to impact 100 chief HR officers very deeply. So everyone's definition of impact may be a little different. But ultimately, what's really important for a thought leader is that there's a strategy along the journey. It doesn't have to be really intense. It could be a lighter layer of work to build that visibility and value, but there needs to be a strategy that's ongoing. Thought leadership is an infinite game. It's not a finite game. It's not a competitive game, even sometimes. It really is staying in the game and staying relevant and staying important. And so that strategy and how you plan for your journey is really important. So we also believe that there's a lot of benefits to investing the time to be a thought leader or to be recognized for that voice. And thought leadership, we've seen it with a lot of the leaders we've worked with, it just unlocks a whole different level of professional recognition, but also a lot of personal satisfaction. They have a lot of joy in framing out their expertise and being able to and thinking about how to share that in ways where others can understand. It does increase their visibility on their ideas and topics so that they're sharing it with broader groups, and there's a lot of great reactions to it. The opportunities that come in, it's hard to predict. Some of these leaders, as they start to speak at companies and are much more visible on LinkedIn, have become LinkedIn influencers. And that's their definition, a leading voice or top voice. And the opportunities that open up when you're a top voice in a particular space, it's not only boards, and there are invites to countries and others to really help them solve some really interesting problems. And so I really have seen thought leadership unlock opportunities and open doors. And so we typically take a lot of our leaders through a whole journey, and we call it really the 5 pillars that we really consider. What is the strategy of thought leadership? How do you design their story arc and also their digital, brand? And the way we think about brand is how others experience you, make it much easier for them to understand who you are and what you represent. We coach our leaders a lot on their communication. Communication with the financial investor audience is very different than podcast communication, very different than communicating with your board, right? And so the practice of how to get your message through very clearly and succinctly is important. And then we help with amplification, identifying opportunities, and ultimately also connections, your social capital. The people you know are also quite important in opening doors and helping you build your platform. Now, this is what we do, but you really don't need experts and strategists supporting you in order to kind of get moving on some of the thought leadership elements. So I often say thought leadership or marketing is not rocket science. It really is spending some time just asking some key questions as you go through the journey. And so I've broken it down to a simpler process for you to just start to ask some really key questions. And this is work that you can do, like spend an hour and really think through this. First and foremost is I always start with why. Why is it so important for you to dedicate some time on your voice, on your thought leadership? Get really anchored on why you're committed to this, because it's an ongoing journey, as we talked about it. It's not a one thought leadership article and done. And how much time do you want to devote to it really comes back to why you're doing this and how important is it. So if it's much more about how do I raise my visibility for my next board? Or how do I raise my visibility for a top public company board? The visibility may be different, top public company versus, let's say, a PE-backed board. The expectations are a little different. So you may need to understand, how much work you need to do there. So understand your why you're committed to it, why you want to devote time to it. But assuming this is important for you for the next few years, you could really start to work on the what and the who. Start to think about, and they're interconnected, the what and the who. Who is the audience? Is it mainly for boards, or are you interested in other things? So I mentioned authors, speaking. Some leaders love being an educator. There may be other aspects in your portfolio life that are very interesting. So who is your audience? Who are you talking to? And then you can really come back to what do you want to say to them? So the who you're talking to, the more you understand them, the better. Your message is going to be much clearer and much more connected to what they care about. Once you have the what and the who, we could really move on to the how. And that's when a lot of leaders skip this step. And I'll go into detail for each of these. A lot of leaders skip this step of how, the how they come across, the emotions that or energy that they bring, or how they say things in 2 minutes versus 5 minutes versus the 10-minute version. It all requires some practice and practice with real people and get their reactions. So sometimes we skip that step. We just focus on the board documents, let's say, and that's 5 or 10% of the equation. It really is, do you come across as a peer? Are you someone that the other board members want to spend 7 years with, 5 years with? So the how really matters. And then last, number 5, then you start to think about where you are going to appear, whether it's at conferences or are you going to share content on social. The where will be heavily guided by how you want to do things, who you want to communicate with, and the what. And I've seen leaders kind of skip right to the where and then feel like, ooh, I'm not very connected. Why am I at this conference? This is not very relevant for me, right? So you almost want to just not think about the where for a while. Focus on the first 4 steps, and then the where will become very clear in terms of where you want to appear.
So Tina,
So
before we move on, could we just spend a moment back on the slide? Because I think this is really great. So thank you for this framework. I mean, I think it's really resonates with me on kind of starting back with the why versus just jumping to the where. Because I know that for myself, I'm, not very good on LinkedIn other than, having a photo and keeping it kind of up to date out there, but I don't post often. So I often go to like, oh, I need to be doing something. But I think this really brings us back to kind of what is my message? And even further back on your earlier slide, we don't have to go back, but you talked about having a strategic plan, and or a strategy for thought leadership. And I'd love to know if a lot of people out there, already have that plan. I certainly don't. I never thought of having thought leadership, of having to have a plan around it so that I can actually go through these 5 steps. And I don't know if I'm alone or other people feel that way, but how difficult is it to really come up with that strategies to start with before you even get to this framework?
We'll wait for you. So I'm gonna try to check a couple bags.
Okay, I think somebody's on needs to go on mute. Who sounds like they're at the airport trying to check
So-
bags. So if you could go on mute if you're not speaking right now, that'd be great. So Tina, maybe you could talk a little bit about that strategic plan, because I found that really interesting, because I don't know.
yeah, well, a lot of us, Barbara, was there anything else? I think you
No,
got
that
muted.
was it. No, somebody muted me, but yeah, no, that was it. It was really kind of back to the strategy around
Yeah,
thought leadership, and how difficult is that to kind of put together?
yeah. So for deeper, so maybe I'll make a quick comment for companies and products. Many of us and have been business leaders, you go really in depth for plans, for strategy and planning. For this, I've seen leaders, if you do it yourself, it really does not have to be too complicated to kind of anchor, as long as even if it's a few pages on a Word document, as you anchor on, why am I doing this? Why is this really important? Who are the audiences that are really important for me? And what key messages, I want to communicate? It doesn't have to be a very complicated document. And I'm happy to share a few examples, even after the program. And I have one last slide at the end. You could see, like, once you anchor on your why and your message and who you're reaching, then it becomes a bit of just by the quarter, even. These are a few activities I want to execute per quarter. And I want to make it very feasible and reasonable for us humans to do, right? But busy executives, busy board members, but it's important to just put it down on paper,
Right.
because oftentimes when we don't put it down, it's kind of sporadic. Whenever I have time to think about it, then it feels a little bit like a hassle. And maybe your audience, you're not really building a consistent voice with your audience because you may post once every 6 months, let's say, and then not post for another, or post for 2 weeks very actively and then not post for 6 months and then post actively. So you want your audience to also get a more consistent voice, from you.
So what you're saying as part of that plan, we should have some milestones, like or commitment around how often we're going to do something, like if it's once a quarter, twice a quarter, whatever, so that you kind of, measure yourself against that versus just here's what I want to do. But it's also important, you're saying, to kind of have a cadence to what
Oh
you
yeah.
do.
Oh
Okay.
yeah. Especially if you're building out your audience and then and your ecosystem, and you want them to really understand that you have that unique voice, right? You want to stay top of mind for them.
Great, thank you.
So if we go to so assuming you know the why you're doing this, the first step is really defining what you want to communicate. And for us, for board members, you really want others to understand what is your unique value, and your unique value proposition. So that becomes the beginning of crafting a message of what you want to say. So understanding what your unique value is first, and then taking that, into messaging. And as you think about your unique value, it's so important to think about, of course, your credentials and your expertise and what you've worked on, your background. But also, we talked about really understand your audience and what their needs are and their pain points or problems that they're trying to solve. So those two are critical. But, there's a third circle here. And I would say I would over-index also on this third circle, which is your purpose, what you're committed to, what brings you joy. You have to really consider this because you can't just only go by your credentials. So I'll give an example. We've worked with an executive who's very well known in her capabilities as a transformation leader. She's been a chief transformation leader for big firms. And what that entailed was a lot of work, of course, but also kind of restructuring the business, letting other departments go, et cetera. When she started thinking about her next 10 years on boards or 15 years on boards, the first reaction she had was, I don't want to do any of that ever again. I really love innovation. I actually love the 10% of my time where I focused on venture and high growth businesses and smaller businesses and the innovation work. And that's her driving purpose for the next 10 years. And so we had to downplay the transformation. She'll, of course, have that credential, but that's not the type of board she's seeking. She's really seeking boards where they're really creative and innovative leaders in the organization or products, and it's a high growth firm. So it's so important that you look at all three areas, and then whatever overlaps could, is the starting place for you to evaluate your value proposition. And then from there could come, your key message of, what's really unique about you and differentiated about you.
There's a great comment in the chat from Teresa about having consistency across all of your messaging, making sure that, your public persona and what you say is your profession and your board work, et cetera, is really consistent as well as authentic. So is that something also that you feel is really important as you think about your unique value, for example?
Absolutely. And I think it's so important to have that consistency so your audience understands this is who you represent, this is your unique voice. Now, having said that, consistency in a year is important. At least you want some room to let your insights breathe, your audience to kind of interpret, understand you. But there are times where we evolve, we have different interests, we'll get involved in different things. And so make sure that your brand, although there's consistency, there's enough room for your brand to evolve. You don't have to do the same thing, have the same voice over and over, but usually we evolve to more adjacent things, and then and that's totally okay.
Great. Thank you.
So the exercise that I often ask leaders to do is just list out these 3 areas. What are the top credentials and expertise? What's your superpower there? Who are the key audiences that you're trying to reach, or who is the one key audience type that you're reaching? And then what brings you joy? What type of things keep you motivated? And then start to see if there's overlaps there. And that's where you're going to find the differentiator. So having done that, once you understand the what, and I'm not going to spend some time on the who, because I would assume you could really understand who you're going to reach. It's great to now start to think a little bit more about how you want to communicate your story. And oftentimes, and there's different ways of storytelling. There are various different forms for storytelling. But we like to keep it simple. And here's one framework where we really ask leaders to start off with, this is what I care about. This is my passion over the 10 years, or this is the type of work that I've really enjoyed leading. And then sharing a little bit about why that's a challenge, what the struggle is in the industry associated. So there's a bit of friction. Whenever you tell stories, there's a bit of friction. And finally, what was the result of some of the work that you've done, and what was the outcome as the hero of the story? And the reason why we use this quick framework is the main purpose is, we're wired for storytelling as humans, and the goal is that you want people to remember you and remember your story 2 weeks after you've spoken with them. Not right there and then, but they can recall your story, they remember who you are. Oftentimes, a lot of our leaders, when they first, come join our community and they are introducing themselves, they start off with, I was the CEO of this, I was the EVP of that, I was VP of something else, and it's a listing. And they may have been SVP at a different firm, and no one can remember, because most of, especially board leaders, yourself, this, and other, you're meeting many executives, and they're listing different, titles. That doesn't really help explain who they are, what they care about, and what impact they've created very succinctly. So I recommend for you to try this as an approach to say, let's say, we have a digital leader who's so passionate about digital transformation. So he'll say, I've been passionate about digital transformation. Unfortunately, in the industry, only 20-30% of transformations come out on the other end successful with a great outcome. And over the past 5 years, I've led 2 or 3 of these initiatives where the outcome on the other end have been X, Y, and Z, right? And it's a quick way where you can even share it in cocktail, events or networking events. You're telling a story. It doesn't feel as if you're citing a resume. So I would really encourage for you to practice this story arc and see how that feels, and practice with other board members. And then think about your personality type as you think about how you come across to others. If you're really knowledgeable and sage-like, feel comfortable staying in that lane. We've had a few leaders who would jump into like a humorous mode at times, like as a jester, and then sometimes they're really serious and knowledgeable, and it confuses your audience if your personality type jumps too much. So think about who you are majority of the time, how you want others to experience you majority of the time, and stay consistent in 2 or 3 personality archetypes. So the how oftentimes connects to story, connects to your personality, modes. And there's a lot of free personality archetype surveys out on Google. And so you could just search one and do a quick test of yourself if you're interested. And so I just have a kind of a framework for how you can practice this, storytelling.
I think Mika's kind of comment in the chat is also kind of just restating what you just said. And I think all of us have to get more comfortable about telling stories because that's what people do remember versus what job they had. Like you said, people forget like who was that CFO or who was that person. It's more around the story that kind of made them unique
Right.
and stand out. So I know you're going to go through some examples, which I think will be great. But I think all of us, aren't really wired. I'm not really wired to think that way because for so long, if you've been an executive, you're just like, I'm so and so and I do this versus like, I'm really passionate about this, and versus not with the goal necessarily of how can I help you, but it's more of the just something that you really believe in. And that brings out your authenticity as well.
Yeah, well, I've been listening to the storyteller at National Geographic's. They have various storytellers, and they tell some of the best stories at Nat Geo. And this one storyteller says it's not a good story unless there's a connection to you. His definition of a good story is not, if it's marketing bullets and has no connections to you, or people are just not that interested if the storyteller is not connected to those bullets in any way. If the story is about someone else but has nothing to do with you also, it doesn't feel as if it's that interesting. You want to always tell the story from a little bit of connection to say, I heard the story, even if it's a distant story, I heard the story and it meant so much to me because let me tell you, and then let me tell you the story. That connects with the audience so much more. So whether you're sharing social, whether you're, telling a story or to your friend, just keep that in mind. If it's something that's relevant for you, it means so much more for the person you're talking to.
So Teresa has a great question here, and that is kind of particular in this community. Are there particular challenges and or opportunities for Asian professionals to develop and communicate our personal brand? What do you see, I guess, as maybe the challenges and then also the opportunities? Because I think some of us, this may not feel comfortable, to be out there kind of telling our story, whatever we think it is, and making sure that it resonates personally to the people that you're talking to or the audience you're trying to reach. So could you comment on that at all in terms of how we might have these unique challenges, but also could be opportunities?
Yeah, and I have a science degree early on. I, of course, didn't focus on science for a long time, but I would say a lot of the Asian leaders in our community come from a STEM background, very data and, science oriented. We also have Asian leaders, of course, who are really characterizing themselves as much more introverted and, want to stay below the radar. They have actually a goal to say, okay, let me stay below the radar if I can. And then I've seen the complete opposite, which are, of course, in any community, Asian leaders who are so great and intentional about how to communicate, even if they are introverts, that they just have a plan and they do it. So I would say, present, a few things. One is none of us, no one's born as a great storyteller. No one's born as a great communicator. No babies, right, are just born with these skill sets. Everyone learns and develops through practice. And even the best, we've got leaders in our community who are on speakers bureaus, and they spent the time to practice and really take their time to practice with audiences and test stories, just like comedians test their little bits. They really test. So if you spend, and I would say the Asian leaders tend to be very good at planning and executing. And so some of the Asian leaders in our community said, I'm not going to evaluate myself I'm going to just put a plan together and I'm going to do it. I'm not going to overthink it. And that's the most important part. Do it, practice, and you'll be very surprised. Communication is one of those things that actually improves very quickly. Versus leadership, there's a lot of components to it. We have a leadership arm to our business. It takes a lot to move the needle or for others to see, are you a better leader? But when it comes to communication skill set, you can improve a lot in 6 months if you deliberately practice.
That's great. That's great advice. There's another question from Tommy Huey, who basically wanted to understand on these personality archetypes. Should we be adjusting our story based on who the audience is in terms of that versus who we are? And how do you incorporate that understanding kind of who your audience is in any given moment?
Yeah, you do want to match your brand a bit to what your audience prefers, certainly. However, these 12 archetypes are the most common archetypes of any character that you could think of in a movie or in TV series. These are the most recognizable archetypes, and they can appear in any industry or audience type and so on. So yes, certain industries might prefer one archetype over another, but actually it's more important that you map the archetype to who you really are and that you're authentic to that personality. Even if it is not the most preferred by your audience, it's good to know, but you could adjust a little bit based on that. But I would really recommend for the archetype to be authentic to who you are. We have one leader who is the COO of a large healthcare organization, and he's a comedian. He's a jester. This is not common in the scientific, kind of leadership community. All his commentaries have humor in it, but it works for him, and people recognize him for that. And it's actually, he uses it very, very well to be differentiated from everybody else. So people follow him very actively, because it's funny and silly, and he doesn't take himself too seriously.
Yeah, so people can relate to that as long as you're authentic to who you are. Can you be more than one type? I think Purvi had a question around,
Yeah,
is it not, it's not an absolute like, okay, I'm this.
right,
You
right.
often can be a blend of more than
I
one.
would usually recommend that you pick two.
Excellent.
3 is hard to combine, but usually pick 2 if you're more than one. And in this case, the example of Denise, she's a leader in our community, Latina, and she's been a chief strategy officer. She focuses on data. She's led market research teams. So there's a 75% when we mapped her that's very sage, like she loves knowledge, she loves learning, and that comes across really clearly. But there's a good 25% of her that's a rebel. She's a Latina lesbian and really got to the C-suite of a large firm, and to her there's a rebelliousness like to her, and she doesn't always want to do things exactly as it's been done in the past. And so you'll see that actually translated into her board resume, her board document, where she has a photo of herself on purpose where her hair is going up a bit, higher, and she's wearing a t-shirt. She's purposely not wearing a suit, or a jacket, because she wants to attract innovative, creative companies that would really want her on the board, and that she could be a little bit of a rebel. Of course, she's really knowledgeable in her work already, but there's that creative and fun and push the boundary part of her that she wants to enjoy also while she serves on boards.
That's great. There's a question here from Laura, and I'm not sure, where this exactly fits in, but maybe you could talk about how you balance kind of multifaceted aspects of our identity when we're telling the story, like understanding we want to be consistent and focused, and we don't want to have more than two personality types here. But how do you balance that, even particularly in situations where it might be contradictory, to the business story we're trying to communicate?
Yeah, yeah. So typically we ask leaders to think about their next 12 months. When you plan your thought leadership, we tend to plan for 12 months. You could plan longer, but the 12 month is most important. And think about who is your primary audience for this 12 months. If you're looking to join a new board, this is a campaign, during this month or during this year, it's a campaign. So that's most active. That's the group you want to communicate with. Keep that as the main thread. It's okay that you could have 10% or 20% sharing on a nonprofit or educational topics that you care about. The majority of your thought leadership is for your primary audience. We tend to recommend that so that it stays consistent and you're getting the outcome that you want. And to the point about evolution, then after 12 months, let's say you gain the board seat, you could start to evolve your brand a bit more to integrate some of the other elements in if you want to. But usually there's always a primary audience for that year. Who are you really trying to reach, and why are you trying to increase the visibility, there? So it goes back to the why. Why are you doing this? Why is it most important for you?
And there's also an observation. There's an observation here that because Denise's particular bio really emphasizes some of her more soft skills. And so, how do you balance the soft skills rather than the hard skills? Or is there an advantage of standing out when you're really kind of emphasizing more of their soft skills? Because those are things that we know boards are looking for. It's hard to demonstrate till you get to that interview that you've got those capabilities. So how much of that should be in your storytelling?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In Denise's case, she leads with some of the hard skills up top, and then she did mention a lot of the soft skills. She did that intentionally because she just wants CEOs or chairs who care about that. She doesn't want to join a board where that's less of a focus. So we had a very intentional conversation around how many more bullets does she want to add? And so, but it was important for her, to add in some of those cultural elements. One of the elements that she talks a lot about in her board interviews is whichever department. She's been president of various different consumer organizations also. And whenever she led a group, the engagement score in that group it just goes up so high. She cares a lot about engagement and culture of the groups that she's led in these big firms. And so it's very clear wherever she goes, the engagement goes way up and it trumps other departments. And she likes to talk about that. And that's important to her. So culture, therefore, becomes a big selling factor. So I think the question is there a story there? Is there a business outcome there that you could talk about also?
Tina, this is kind of a maybe sensitive question, but I want to just raise it because I see this on Denise's bio around D&I or DEI. And then, because I think many of us probably have had something to that effect. Not that we are, a DEI candidate, but so much about a passion around that topic. Where do you see that right now in terms of receptibility, or should people not be having that on their bio? Because I know people who have just pulled that kind of stuff off, even though it's truly part of who they are, and probably a part of who many of the people on this call today is something that we're passionate about, our community as well as others. And so I just wondering where that might fit, if that is something that you're truly, if people should be holding back on that right now.
Yeah, it really is a challenge right now where we're sorting through with a lot of leaders. Some want, and it comes down to personal preferences too. Some want to be very open and direct about that there's diversity is still very important. And I think most business leaders agree with that, although they're not as vocal about it. So some want to still keep that, as a conversation piece for boards. And that's their personal preference. The others really want to soften the language or adjust the language and focus much more on culture. And if they haven't led a DEI group, they oftentimes do, change that a bit. And again, preference, there's no right or wrong. It's really how they're thinking about it. But the third element, we've had leaders where it's such a struggle, where let's say in the financial organizations, they get their funding from Texas or they get their funding from particular states. They'll openly say, we're not, like, don't put that. And we're not, DEI, we're not supportive of that. And it comes down to whether you want to join a board or not, associated or with that level of strong opinion on this, or non-acceptance. Actually, very openly they would say, we don't want to sponsor or support companies that are focused on with DEI focus. They'll say ESG also, and they'll say a few other things.
Yeah.
And so it's a personal evaluation of whether you want to join boards like that.
But that's really helpful, because I do think it also depends on the kind of board you're looking for. And if that is something that you're passionate about, you're probably not going to be attracted to a company who's really against DEI at this point, or very publicly. So I think you're right. It's a personal choice, and kind of back to that, who's your audience, and what are you trying to accomplish, or what's your plan? So I want to do a quick time check, because we have about 10 minutes left, and I know there's a few more things that you want to cover today. So I'm going to skip. I know there's a couple other questions there, but we're going to get into some of the social media and amplification of his story, and I'm going to make sure we cover that. And I'll come back to questions if we have time. Okay.
Wonderful, wonderful. So as I mentioned earlier, don't focus on the where you're going to amplify until you really anchor in on what you want to say and who your audience is, right? And how you want to say it, how you want others to experience you. But once you work through that, then the where becomes much more focused. If your audience is private equity firms, then where you're going to show up are private equity conferences, conferences where PE leaders are part of, or board members of PE-backed companies are the people you're going to network with. It gets very specific. So I would really recommend, of course, leaving where to the very end, and then you could really consider it. Where you appear, we typically think of it in different categories. One is the shared content. So this is social media. You could share and engage with your ecosystem. The owned content tends to be content that you write yourself or you come up with yourself. No one really has the right to change your story. So this relates to the bylines or newsletters. It's going to appear the way you want it to appear. For thought leadership, we highly encourage for you to anchor much more on owned content and shared content, just because you have control over the narrative. This is your reputation. This is your visibility. You want to control your reputation, at least for the first page of the Google, of Google. If others search you, you kind of want to populate the first page with content that you feel like, okay, I had more control over. And then over time, as you become, much more well-known in your space, and you want to do some earned, which is another category, earned media, then you can be interviewed by reporters or others, and then they could write it up, but you really don't have control over exactly how it's going to appear. This is not company news, so it doesn't have to go to the earned media space, but some leaders in our community are, of course, CEOs and others, and they have to go in the earned media, and that's a great way to gain global visibility, but they have to be very well practiced, for that setting. I would really encourage speaking as a type of earned media, but you still have more control. So even if you go to a Forbes conference and a Fortune conference, Yes, it's a media outlet, but you have much more control over what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. So if you're going to focus on earned, I would really recommend going through the live programming part, of some of these earned media outlets. And last but not least, I want to say strategic networking is so important, right? Because there's nothing like really getting to know you, building out your network with the right strategic decision makers. So you need both digital shared content so that you could share your thoughts, you stay relevant, but then also you need that strategic network and the relationships. And I could show you some examples of shared content. Back to the comment of you need a little bit of you in there. So like, why was this content important for you? So if you share content, you'll see Christine Miller, she says, being a CEO, this is something that she's always cared about. It's really important to have a strong purpose. So it's relevant for her. For Lisa, she shared that this is her 4th year serving on the board of trustees for the American Ballet Theater. I mean, that's so important for her, right? So it's relevant, and she's mentioning it from her point of view. So you'll see these type of posts, people really engage with it. They really like to hear about why is this content, important for you. For owned content, I also want to just give a few examples. There's a lot of owned content platforms out there. You can contribute articles, and I think most leaders don't know that. Forbes has Forbes Council. Fast Company has the executive board. There's Medium and a few other outlets like Sway that's very focused on women leaders. You can use ChatGPT to help you create like a topic, a summary, or a listing of topics for your future, articles, and then start to create outlines or a piece where you could edit and then you could contribute. So I would really recommend for everyone to just take a look at some of the criterias for these contributor platforms. And once you sign up, you have a platform where you can submit pieces, and their editors will work with you to give you some commentaries, and you could agree or disagree, final edit it, and you'll know exactly how it's going to appear on Fast Company. Like, for example, Fast Company executive board, they do have some criteria. You have to be an executive, but I think, or a board member of companies that are over 2 million in size. So it's not too big of a hurdle. So everyone on this webinar should be able to, kind of connect to it. For podcasts, if you're ever interested in being a guest, it's a great way to share your knowledge. It's conversational, a little less practice needed because you could go long form, and you could just look on your Apple Podcasts by topic, and you'll find the podcasts that are, linked to that topic or theme. And most podcast hosts get their guests through LinkedIn messaging or social media messaging. You can look up the podcast host's name and just send a quick LinkedIn message. They'll respond. Majority of them will respond. And that's what people don't realize. That podcast is a very friendly media. So if you're interested in being on their podcast where you've heard one episode and you think, I could share a perspective related to leadership or mentorship, I'm going to reach out to them. They're usually very receptive to have a conversation. And Barbara, I'm just going to rush through the last 2 slides so others can see too. Conferences in the same way. You could I often lean on AI to help search and say, hey, chat, search for conferences in policy and healthcare policy. What's coming up? I want the most prestigious ones, or I want industry specific ones. And they will show you, some of the conferences that are coming up. So last but not least, just to, overall, when you assess where you show up, really think about how much is in the owned space and how much is in the earned or shared space, right? So I should say owned and shared is where we want you to focus more for your thought leadership. So whether it's emails or websites or social presence, those are more owned by you. And then you may want a few earned, outlets. But you don't need all of your content, in earned. And just don't forget to plan for the journey. So Barbara, to your question, it doesn't have to be complicated. It could be something as simple as this, to say Q1, I'm going to update my LinkedIn profile a little bit more to the message that I've designed. I'm going to practice my storytelling with 3 leaders and get their feedback. I'm going to try to write 1 short article, nothing long, maybe 500 words or 750 words. And let me try to contribute it somewhere. And then just send 1 or 2 messages to 2 podcast hosts. That's all I want to do in Q1. And, Q2, you can move on. But I want to share that because just to show everyone, building your thought leadership journey should not be too cumbersome. But if you have a little bit more intention and focus, you'd be surprised, how much you could get done.
Great. Well, I know we could talk about this for hours. I think there are so many more questions and wonderful comments out there, but thank you so much, Tina. This was super practical and helpful. And I think the way that you broke it down into having the strategy and the framework and practicing, something that we could all do. I know there was a great comment in the chat around, someone out there, practices at all networking events, just tries different, elevator speeches and things like that. And I think a lot of it is just getting really clear on our purpose and what brings us joy. And I think all of us know what that is, and often maybe don't think about incorporating that into kind of who we are as we tell our story. So thank you so much. We just have a minute here. We probably don't have time for another question, but I will say that we are going to have a recap of the call today that Kate will send out shortly after the call, along with a copy of Tina's slides. And there'll be a link to the recording. We did record the session today, so if you wanted to go back and listen to it again, you're welcome to. But on behalf of NACD and Ascend Pinnacle, thank you so much, Tina. This was so valuable and really inspiring. And thank you for making it simple and not intimidating. Because I think it's a little bit daunting, and I'm one of those people who is often intimidated about getting things like this out there. So hopefully it'll make it easier as we think about what we really need to do next.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. And even if you don't have to do all of the above, but pick one thing and try it.
Yes.
I think you'd be very surprised. People start recognizing you for that content. So thank you. Hopefully this is valuable for everyone.
Hey, thank you everyone for joining today, and I look forward to seeing you on the next call.